Good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of the Institute of Cornish Studies, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our Climate Assembly. So I'm Joanie Willett, and along with Gary Tregiger, I'm a co-director of the Institute of Cornish Studies. And our Cornwall Climate Assembly is forming a part of the University of Exeter's Green Future programme, which looks at how we can use University of Exeter research in order to be able to combat climate problems. Okay, so what are we going to be doing over the next couple of hours? Well, firstly, thank you ever such a lot for coming along, whether you're an expert witness, participant, or policy listener. Thank you ever such a lot for coming along. The objective of today's session is the object of our Climate Assembly is we're going to be spending the next couple of hours talking about what we think that our policy priorities should be in Cornwall if we're going to combat climate change. And we're going to start out our session with our expert witnesses, and then all of our participants will have a chance to discuss your thoughts and priorities in our breakout sessions. And then your breakout group facilitator will present the discussion that you had in your breakout groups to our policy listeners. Remember that policy isn't just about what local government do or what Cornwall Council do, although the work of Cornwall Council is incredibly important, and I'm really, really happy that we've got a representative from Cornwall Council that's joining us today. But it's also, policy is also about what other businesses, organisations and bodies do, and how people decide on the kinds of, how they're going to conduct their operation. And this includes organisations such as the National Trust, which is one of Cornwall's largest landowners, Creative Kernow, which is thinking through about what the creative and the cultural sector can do to connect us with our environment, and the Cornwall Museums Partnership for their role in culture and memory and creating the stories about who we are in Cornwall, whilst or to tackle our changing climate. So our policy listeners represent all of these organisations and include Luke Pollard. Luke Pollard is an MP for Plymouth and served as a Shadow Environment Secretary from January 2020 until November 21. Lizzy Carlyle is the Head of Environmental Practices for the National Trust. Emmie Kell is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cornwall Museums Partnership. Fiona Wotton, CEO of Creative Kernow, and Councillor Martyn Alvey, who's the Cornwall Council Cabinet Member with responsibility for the environment. They'll be joining us later, but first we wanted to introduce you to our expert witnesses. And of course, many of you will already have your own ideas about what you feel our climate priorities are or should be. But we thought we'd introduce you to some of our University of Exeter research about Cornwall and climate change, and what some of our researchers feel that our priorities should be. So we're going to start with Professor Clare Saunders, who will be talking to us about sustainable clothing. And then we'll be moving on to Professor DeSilvey, who will talk about heritage and climate change. And then Professor Steffen Boehm about reusing resources in a circular economy. Professor Juliet Osborne, protecting our pollinators. And then last but by no means least, Dr Ian Ashton, who's going to be talking to us about marine renewables. All of these is about research that's been conducted in Cornwall and is directly related to our environment in Cornwall. Okay, I think it's definitely time to get started. So without further ado, are you ready, Claire? If we pass over to you first of all.
Hi everybody, I hope you can hear me well. So my name's Clare Saunders, I'm a professor in politics on the Penryn campus of the University of Exeter. Joanie's asked me to talk about sustainable fashion. And I suppose first I should say why I think sustainable fashion is a priority when thinking about how to deal with climate change. And I think that's because it faces two huge challenges. One is our current economic models, which are based on producing huge amounts of goods and consuming them. Fashion is a great example of that, particularly exemplified through fast fashion, where something you buy last week may no longer be in fashion the following week, which encourages a kind of buy now, throw away culture. And then I think another priority is around behaviour change, encouraging people to change their behaviours, but not to put all of the onus on the feet of people themselves, but to devise policies that help people to make behavioural changes. And I think fashion exemplifies those two things really nicely. But Joanie also asked me to say a few words about why fashion is a big environmental problem in the first place. Textiles comes second, would you believe it, after the big fossil fuel giants for their contribution to climate change. And the fashion industry has definitely come under the spotlight for its negative environmental effects. It came to my attention in 2013 through kind of social justice issues when the Rana Plaza building collapsed in Bangladesh and 1,132 really poorly paid workers died in an accident. They were forced to go and work in a building that they could see was unsafe, that fell down on them. And then that sort of encouraged Fashion Revolution, a massive NGO, to shed light on the fashion industry and all of the other effects that it has. So as well as being the biggest contributor to climate change after the fossil fuel industries, it has a huge series of other environmental effects. For example, it takes something like 10,000 litres of water to just create one pair of jeans. A t-shirt produces the equivalent of something like 6 kilograms of carbon from one t-shirt. That's something like 20 times its weight in carbon. Cotton accounts for something like a quarter of pesticides that are used worldwide. And then there are all the microfibers that come from artificial wools and artificial fabrics, like your synthetic fibers. And they're found everywhere. They're found in mammals, in fish, in our bodies, and they're thought to disrupt our endocrine system and possibly be carcinogenic as well. Not to mention things like formaldehyde that's put on the types of products that come ready creased or come iron proof. And synthetic dyes opens up a whole new kettle of fish. Absolutely disgusting in a way, fast fashion is. And that's complicated through really long and complex supply chains and all of the clothing miles that are embedded. I mean, if you think about how far a t-shirt travels before it gets to us in this country, if the cotton's picked in the US, that's then sent to somewhere else to be spun, somewhere else to be turned into a t-shirt and finally shipped over here. So it's colossal. So what we need to think about perhaps is trying to find ways to slow down this colossal giant that is the fashion industry in similar ways to which we probably need to slow down other forms of consumption. It's coming up for Christmas. I wonder how many of us are going to end up buying lots of pointless Christmas stuff. That's also something to think about. We can't all be like Gandhi. Gandhi's my hero. Gandhi used to spin his own cloth from local cotton and just basically live in a loincloth and a dhoti. Very, very simple clothing. We can't expect people to do that, but we can try to make some attempts to localize and sustainabilize clothing, local supply chains, and making do and mending. And in some of my research that I've worked on with Joanie, we've tried to encourage people to change their behavior, having identified that there's a massive behavior gap between caring a lot about the environment and being able to halt one's consumption. We looked into something called social practice theory, which suggests that in order to change people's behaviours, including around clothing, you need to provide people with 3 basic things. The first thing is the stuff to that you can physically use to make a change. So if we're thinking about clothing, we might want to be providing people with space in which they can make and mend clothes, providing them with sewing machines, providing them with scissors, providing them with fabric, etc. You also have to provide a sense of meaning. You have to make sure that people understand why what they're doing is important and make it make sense to them, and also provide people with the competencies to be able to make judgments about various things that they're doing. So the stuff, the competencies and the meanings. And we did this, we did a little experiment with a project called the S4S project, where we engaged people in a series of 40 one-day-long workshops making and mending clothing. And we just did discover that this made a significant difference to the way they thought, they felt, and they acted in relation to their clothing. And perhaps this is a model where you provide the stuff, the competencies, and the meaning that could be applied to lots of other sectors, the food sector, the consumption sector in general, the travel sector, And maybe that would create the correct drivers through various policies to encourage much more environmentally friendly ways of being, slowing down our economy and making it more environmentally sustainable. So thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm on. There wasn't really a switch over, but I'm Caitlin DeSilvey, and I'm a professor of cultural geography, and I'm based in the Environment and Sustainability Institute here on the Penryn campus. And I've been asked to talk to you about some of the research I've been doing on heritage and climate change, and I'm just going to time myself as well. So it won't be news to any of you that the environment is changing, and this includes our historic environment. So in Cornwall and elsewhere, we're seeing increased coastal erosion, storm damage, flooding, drought, and all of these processes affect the integrity of what practitioners would call our heritage assets, so structures, buildings, but also wider cultural landscapes. And the work that I'm doing is focused on the puzzle that heritage policy isn't really designed to cope with the situation we find ourselves in around climate change challenges. Because the main focus of heritage regulation is on protection, designating valued assets, identifying heritage at risk. And the main aim is to conserve the material fabric of heritage assets. And this has been broadly successful. Heritage is incredibly important to Cornish identity and also its viability as a visitor destination. And so a lot of that work can and will continue into the future and is incredibly necessary and important. But in some cases, business as usual just won't be possible in the future when it comes to heritage and the rub up against climate change and accelerated environmental change. So some heritage, particularly coastal heritage, will be too difficult or too expensive to protect as climate change accelerates. And we will have to think about letting go. So for every viewed storm tower that we can move inland, which is fantastic, there's going to be another heritage asset that can't be saved. And I did a quick check yesterday. There are currently over a dozen coastal cliff castles and promontory forts on the heritage at risk register. And if you look at the register, you can see their principal vulnerability is coastal erosion, the trend declining, the likelihood of any improvement for those structures pretty low. So we need new approaches and new policies and new ways of working with places that it's not going to be practical or possible to protect. And for the past 2 years, I've been working on a collaborative project with Historic England, the National Trust and Natural England as part of the UKRI Landscape Decisions Programme. And as a collective, we've been thinking about how to cope with this kind of inevitable transformative change that's coming down the line in relation to heritage. And particularly, we've been interested in finding more positive and proactive ways of responding when assets can't be saved. We've developed a concept we're calling adaptive release. So it's related to adaptive reuse. And think about those cliff castles. What we're trying to do with the concept of adaptive release is to frame what is happening to them not in terms of loss and failure, but actually in terms of acceptance of change and working with the kind of change that we are experiencing. And what this might mean is relinquishing some control, working with natural process rather than holding a line for some of these places, being open to the emergence of natural and cultural heritage significance, so exposed archaeology or maybe a better understanding of geological features, but also being involved in phases of recording and release. So you might involve local communities in monitoring these places as they change, as with the current project that's going on at St. Leven Chapel. And I think there's a lot of work that would need to be done to shift policy to allow this to happen, because currently policy is really focused on protecting those special interests in these listed and designated assets. And the active accommodation of change can be quite a sticky point when it comes to this kind of approach. And I think passive neglect is often the default, where you allow something to gradually change without making an explicit decision that you're actually going to work with that change. So that's what we've been trying to encourage. And I'll put some links in the chat if people are interested in reading more. But this is part of a sort of broad area of focus around figuring out new ways of embracing and working with change in the environment. And really trying to address what's coming at us in the future in a way that's a little bit more proactive and less reactive. Thanks.
Right, I guess it's my turn now. Hello, everyone. My name is Steffen Boehm. I'm Professor of Organisation Sustainability at the University of Exeter Business School, also working on the Penryn campus here in Cornwall. And I just want to talk to you briefly about what I call a place-based circular economy. So, as we all know, global greenhouse gases keep on going up. The emissions are keep on going up. For 30 years now, we've been talking about the climate crisis at the highest possible political level, but we haven't seen the necessary step change in policy, in the way businesses are run, in our daily behavior even. So one interesting statistic I came across is that over the last 30 years, we have emitted more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than in the previous 200 years. So it just shows that all the talking hasn't really helped. All the curves are showing in the wrong direction. And this is just greenhouse gases. Planet Earth overall is really bleeding under the strain of extractive, polluting human activity. And I'm afraid that's not all. Our societies and economies are not really working well as well. The gap between those who have a lot and those who have very little is getting wider and wider, and we can see that all too clearly here in Cornwall as well. From a material resource point of view, the picture is not much better. The UK economy has a material footprint of around 22 tons per capita, and this includes all the stuff that we are importing, which we mustn't forget, since most of the stuff we buy these days seems to be made abroad, particularly in countries like China. And what's sometimes forgotten is that everybody talks about resource efficiency, but even if every business in the country would apply a so-called high resource efficiency paradigm, all the efficiency gains would simply be outstripped by increasing growth. So simply just going for resource efficiency will not help us, because we are still wedded to the GDP growth mantra. So we're really wasting resources at a global scale, at an unprecedented scale. This makes no economic and no social and certainly no environmental sense. We are literally giving away millions of pounds worth of materials because we don't have the systems in place to reuse them, to remanufacture them, or to recycle them. So what can be done about this? We literally have to design a new economic system. I argue that this needs to be what I call a place-based circular economy. That stops wasting resources, but also an economy that works for local people and for our Cornish environment, which we desperately need to regenerate as well. So if this all sounds too abstract, let me give you an example. All the food that we waste on a daily basis in a place like Falmouth, for example, in households, in hotels, in restaurants, in coffee shops, even on the university campus, all of this food waste is often ending up in black bins. And all of this could be collected, composted, and then put as nutrient-rich compost, could be put back onto agricultural fields, or could be used on community veg patches that support local communities. And the vegetables that we grow on these fields can be then sold again and used again in locality, in our place. This would create local jobs, it would reduce food miles, it would improve nutrition as well, give kids a way to know where food comes from, and of course, massively reduce food waste. So I imagine a future where we could have industrial composters in all key locations in Cornwall, where we could also compost the biodegradable food cartons and coffee cups, which are very much used today in hospitality, but they often end up in black bin bags. That makes no sense whatsoever. So we need to compost this in place to actually compost them. So I call this a place-based or local circular economy that saves resources, works for the people, and works for our local environment. And I'm glad to say that we are working on some of these projects as part of the TEVI project here in Cornwall. So there's so many opportunities that a local circular economy could provide. So I suggest we need to grab them and grab them now to deal not just with the climate emergency, but the wider environmental and social emergency as well. Thank you. And I will now hand over to Juliet Osborne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steffen. My name's Professor Juliet Osborne. I'm an applied ecologist studying pollinators and biodiversity, particularly in the farmed environment. I'm going to make the case for insect pollinators and why we should protect them in the face of climate change and the ecological crisis, and also as their role as a flagship group for biodiversity within Cornwall. So insect pollinators are crucially important. 90% of our flowering plants depend on insect pollinators. And I'm not just talking about bees, but wasps, butterflies, moths, and other flower visiting insects. For us humans, we rely on them. Most of our fruit and vegetable and oilseed crops and our protein crops like beans rely on insect pollination, so they're essential for our food security. But they're also essential to other insects, birds, and mammals in terms of their role as food within the ecosystem. And of course, the seeds and the fruits that are produced as a result of pollination are essential food within those ecosystems as well. So they are crucial, the backbone of our ecosystems. In Cornwall, our horticultural production, our courgettes, our soft fruit and our orchard fruits depend on insect pollination. And our meadows and our hedgerows and our gardens would definitely not look the same and so floriferous if it wasn't for these pollinators. We know what is happening to these pollinators. We know they're in decline. Bees, butterflies, moths, and hoverflies at least are in decline. And we know why. We know that they have far less habitat than they used to have. We've reduced their food sources available by our intensive use of the land. Intensive grasslands in particular are very hostile places for pollinators. And of course, light and pesticide pollution and the changing environment with the climate. And we know that Cornwall itself has a haven of some of the rarest bee species in the country, like the ginger carder bees, Bombus humilis and Bombus muscorum in particular. People are already making a bit of a difference in Cornwall. I have to say Cornwall Council have been leading that in terms of the Cornwall Pollinator Action Plan, which is fantastic, and projects that we've been engaged in, such as making space for nature and improving green spaces in our urban towns, which is not just good for people, but also good for biodiversity and pollinators, we find. And also the changes in how road verge has been managed with less mowing. It saves money from the council and from our council taxes. It's also good for pollinators and other wildlife as well. So there are examples and many initiatives from individual landowners, communities and businesses about how they're trying to improve spaces. The challenge we have right now is how we upscale that across the whole county, and also we get the long-term investment to make sure it sticks. Because actually pollinators are a means by which we can see whether we're aiming to conserve biodiversity on a broader scale as well. And the note of caution is if we just head toward focus on carbon net zero and reducing our emissions, that may change our land management. That may have knock-on effects on biodiversity. I mean, there might be trade-offs there, that some things that are good for carbon emissions might not be so good for biodiversity. So I think we need to really think about that carefully. And if after what I've said, you're still not really caring about pollinators, then I think we need to imagine what Cornwall would look like without them, without honey, without the blue, pink and white hedgerows that we all adore in the spring, without our bluebell woods looking blue in the spring, or our heather moors looking purple, without the floral colour in our famous gardens. And actually at this time of year, our hedgerows are festooned with the berries for Christmas, the holly berries, the ivy berries, the sloes, and so forth. And that's all down to the hard work that those insects have done earlier in the year on those flowers. So I think helping pollinators is not just good for pollinators, it's good for our food, it's good for people, and it's also good for the community and the distinctiveness of our county of Cornwall. So that's my pitch. I'm now going to hand over to Ian.
Hello, thanks Juliet. Hi everyone. My name's Ian Ashton. I'm a senior lecturer in the Renewable Energy Group. Here I'm based at the Penryn campus, and I've been asked to talk about marine renewable energy. Our group, I think since 2003, we deliver what was the UK's first renewable energy degree. So we cover a range of different renewables, things like solar, energy storage and power systems. But personally, I trained as an oceanographer, and my research is in marine renewables and other infrastructure that goes into the sea, such as aquaculture. I look at measurement and monitoring of the ocean to support kind of planning, design and implementation of structures we put in the sea. As part of that, in Cornwall, I've led projects to measure the waves and currents and support technology development. There's been some world first field trials here in Falmouth Bay, and our projects supported that from initial concepts right up to ongoing support for companies looking at multi-million-pound offshore wind farm installations at the moment. I think the case for marine renewables at the moment is that offshore wind has sort of quietly developed and is now providing consistent energy to our national grid. It's a part of our energy mix, and looking forward, it is one of the key components for globally for our net zero future, for an energy supply, and it's getting real focus in industries from some of the world's largest companies. Here in Cornwall, there may be little evidence of that process, no turbines in the sea, but there is a surprising number of marine industries here in Cornwall, sort of termed a cluster of maybe innovative technical industry that are supporting these sectors. And like I said, we've had some world first testing. Our ports are seeing vessels to be serviced and refitted for the new requirements of offshore wind. I think the growth recently in offshore wind particularly has been fairly staggering, but it's actually set to accelerate. We're looking at 7-fold increase on the installed capacity that we see today by 2030, and hence the interest from large multinational companies, because it's really set to overtake some of the major global industries. And that's kind of globally. Cornwall itself has some potential here. We have seas, and it could provide energy, space for renewable energy, space for turbines. But it also has maritime potential beyond that. It has diverse, productive, really fascinating seas. So also looking at things like aquaculture and innovative marine protection that will help recover what could be damaged marine ecosystems, with the aim being to support more productive, healthier and more attractive marine environments with marine renewables as part of that. So I guess in summary, why marine renewables in Cornwall climate policy? I think they will provide the contribution to global climate targets. They will be a major industry, and our climate policy should reflect that. The policy should reflect the direct contribution of our seas to that process, having turbines in our seas, having those technologies, and how we would like to see them, and how that matches with the sort of potential for other uses of our seas, and how we can use them to see, like I said, healthier, more attractive, more biodiverse marine environments, as well as respond to these coming pressures on using our marine spaces. So those pressures seem inevitable. So Cornwall's climate policy should take into account that to try and get the seas that we want to see. That's it for me.
I think there's so many things that we need to be aware of and to and think about over the next few years, especially. Okay, so now we're going to be asking all of our participants to do an absolutely massive job and to decide amongst yourselves about what our top 3 climate priorities in Cornwall should be. So I think it's high time now to move into our breakout rooms to discuss this. And remember that you don't have to choose out of the areas that our expert witnesses discussed about. You might have your own thoughts and priorities that you want to bring to the table as well. But between you, you'll need to choose the 3 priorities that you would like our policy listeners to take away. The 3 priorities that you want our policy listeners to take away. And also we want you to think about how these policies could be implemented as well. So your job is to find persuasive arguments to convince our policy listeners your 3.5 minute presentation slot about what course of action you think that they should take. But first of all, we're going to be going straight back into our feedback sessions. So we're going to begin. We were having a really interesting sort of set of discussions in breakout group 1, and the point we're making that that just looking at a couple of these different things, just looking at a couple of the different kind of elements of climate change is too small. That actually everything is interconnected. We can't really pick out one particular priority. But one of the things that was coming out really, really clearly, and that is really important, I think, to feedback, is about adaptation and about how, as individuals, communities, but also as organisations, that we're able to adapt to our changing environment, or make the changes that we need to in our environment. And there was a couple of different threads that were coming out on this. One of the last points that was being made as we as we were leaving the breakout groups was about how a lot of emphasis feels like it's being made on regular people, but there's only so much that regular people can do. Instead, it also needs to be about the work that our organisations are doing as well. Our organisations and institutions also need to be changing behaviours and thinking through about what it is that needs to happen, or what they can be doing, and sort of thinking through about some of the complexities about where the individual becomes asked to do, to be more environmentally friendly, whereas maybe some of our policies at a bigger level don't really reflect that. And we're also talking a lot about how, in order to be able to make that adaptation, and in order to be able to bring on board the behaviour changes that we need in order to meet our climate challenges, that requires money. Actually, it requires money, but also feedback mechanisms. So we're talking about how being able to feed back between the things that communities need and the things that communities need, the resources that communities need in order to be able to do the things that they need, but then and feeding that into government, whether that's at a local or a national level. Those systems need to be put in place, and the money needs to be put in place as well in order to make sure that there's funding and resources available. One of the really important points that came out of this, and I'm just about to wrap up because I'm running out of time. But one of the really important points that was made is that actually connecting people to nature, encouraging those adaptations, encouraging changes in behaviour change is really, really crucial, because with each generation that loses touch with nature, we also lose an understanding and awareness about our environments, with all of the massive issues that brings, whether we're talking about natural grazing and farmland management, or whether we're talking about the things that we put into our waters or whatever. Okay, I'm stopping. Nick, your turn.
Hi. We also talked about just the multitude of stuff and how it's all connected, and it's really hard to kind of pick one out and not have the rest fall down, but we did manage to nail down three points, and our first was around recycling and composting, which is clearly a massive topic. It was noted that Cornwall Council has removed a high number of kind of local composting and recycling facilities, and there needs to be more assurance, perhaps moving forward, that locally the council is taking this issue seriously. Especially important is about moving the kind of food waste initiative forward, and creating local points and urban clusters for composting and food waste. It's a thing that we believe communities could really embrace, and there's some good schemes in Devon and especially in Exeter that we could learn from. Our second point, we talked a bit around insulation and the use of fossil fuels in homes still, and how we need to stop heating our homes with oil and think about how homes can be made more energy efficient in Cornwall. For example, does the council encourage home refits? If not, then that's something that's going to have to be done and be done pretty soon. If there should be subsidies, we argued, then they should go towards this, because it also has a massive effect on things like fuel poverty and stuff. Our third point was on public transport. Electrification is obviously the goal moving forward, but there's also a massive issue with empty buses running consistently. Does it make sense, for example, for buses to still run on timetables, or should they run on demand? At the moment, they're kind of subsidized, and many routes are subsidized for making a loss and with empty journeys. So we could look at alternative timetables, and that could be something that could be achieved much quicker than electrifying fleets of buses. This is something that we could use much more quickly. I promised I'd mention to divest pensions as well across Cornwall. That was kind of my 3.5 point. They've so far the council has promised to do this by to de-invest them in oil and fossil fuel companies. The council has promised to do this by 2045, but this needs to be done much quicker. And that's a wrap.
Okay, hello everyone. I think I'm next then, so I'll just jump in. I will try and accurately represent my group here, but I think the chat is still open, so if I miss anything, please do just drop in a comment. So there were 3 key points that we discussed that were extremely incisive and relevant, I think. First of all, there was a point brought up on education, climate education in young people in particular, which I thought was super relevant, is education on the kinds of infrastructural shifts that might be necessary to combat climate change, also on the effects of climate change, and also on the social, political, economic, as they are connected, changes that come with shifting systems to address or live in a world that is sort of post-climate change, or dealing with the constant effects of climate change, that I thought was super interesting. Another thing connected to that was also heritage. The use of heritage as an educational tool to educate the public on the history of climate destruction, and to use heritage spaces to allow the public to engage with the climate crisis as it unfolds. Obviously, there is the phenomenon of climate anxiety, which is especially present in young people, that needs to be addressed. So a sort of more complete and broad education of climate change, the changes that are necessary, the changes that are being made, may be relevant to allay some of the fears that are developing in particularly young people who will have to deal with the brunt of the worst effects of climate change. So education, first of all. A second point for Cornwall also was changing infrastructure, developing infrastructure in Cornwall, and taking advantage of its geographical site and its location. That is its maritime positioning. It's obviously a very effective location for the development of windmills, water turbines, etc., that are placed on coastal areas. But also a key point there, which we discussed, which is very interesting, was the connection of that opportunity also to the effects of climate change on coastal areas. So that is, of course, coastal areas are quite vulnerable to the effects of climate change, particularly coastal flooding, high tides, that sort of thing, storm fronts. So the connection of developing infrastructure on coastal areas also needs to be connected to the development of resilience for coastal areas, especially in Cornwall. So there are opportunities and there are also constraints there that need to be addressed, I think, and the group thought also. The final point was on public transport, which I think Nick just went over also. The electrification of public transport was mostly brought up. The need for a sustainable transport network, which relates to those which are already being developed in most modern cities throughout the world. Key area like London in this country and Bristol. And so electrified buses and also changes to the way that public transport is used in order to reduce individual car-driven transport, that sort of thing. Anyway, so I've run over my time here, but I hope I covered everything, and thank you. I'll just leave it there.
That's right. I think I can talk about our the last group. So, like some of the others have discussed in our group, we really looked at both the infrastructural changes necessary, but also the more systemic change, specifically around behaviour change that we need to see in Cornwall to match any infrastructural amendments. So we looked at three particular areas. So one of those, as others have covered, was transport. So looking at how do we encourage that modal shift away from cars, whether they are fossil fuel cars or transitioning to electric vehicles, to walking, cycling, public transport, and acknowledging that we need the behaviour change, but we also need that infrastructure to be there so that connectivity is available, whether that's around bus routes, around things like public e-bikes. But we also talked about this more systemic and cultural shift. We discussed the 15-minute cities model that's quite popular at the moment, and how there's a need to reorganise our lives and our towns away from cars. Is everything we need within reach? We talked about housing a lot, both in terms of energy and insulation, but also in terms of access. So we're talking about closing some of the loopholes around holiday lets, making sure that they're kind of clear and communicated. Planning laws, so making sure that all buildings are insulated properly, but again, more in this systemic frame, talking about like what we're not seeing in the green homes development, looking at what, rather than looking at what's the cheapest answer and solution in every area, what do we look at the opportunity to recognise local economy growth? So a local supply chain for green homes. So for example, we have local tradespeople doing the installation. What are the skills that they need? We have local farmers creating particular materials. So really using that as an opportunity to build and sustain a local economy to meet the need that is there. And then the biggest issue we talked about was consumption. How are we consuming? And this linked to ideas around circular economy and needing those circular approaches, but also the need to reduce our need for transport, energy, goods. And it's also had a really strong link to health and well-being, which is a theme across all of our priorities. In terms of how we make these happen, we talked about an importance that the policy emphasis reaches people who are already in those conversations, who are the voices of experience and need to be part of developing and changing those policies. Talked about potential opportunities to raise funding. Could we have a tax on second homeowners, for instance, which obviously is a complex issue, to fund the circular economy? So really linking the issue and potential solutions. And then lastly, a really key thing emerging around skills. If we are trying to promote behaviour change to support the reduction of consumption, what are the skills and training we need to develop new skills in what we make, what we repair, but also where are the examples, where's the inspiration, and how do we make sure that is communicated? So yeah, that was our group.
Sorry, I'm always a little bit slow moving between mute and video and all of that kind of stuff. Nice one. Thank you so much. There's just such a lot of such a sort of diverse range of things that you've all been covering, and really thought-provoking ideas there as well. Really interested to know more about what our policy listeners are going to make of your thoughts and reflections. Thank you such a lot, everybody, for taking part, and Nick, Harry, and Peter as well for facilitating the groups and for presenting this so well. Okay, if we could start out, so now we're going to be talking to our policy listeners who have been considering what we've been saying in the presentations as part of the discussion, the broader discussions as well. And I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes with your thoughts and reflections about the priorities that you've heard and how that might work in your organisation, whether there's anything, the things that you feel that you would like to take for your organisation or within your political representative role in order to be able to combat climate change. Okay, so we're going to start out with Luke Pollard MP. Luke is MP for Plymouth and served as Shadow Environment Secretary between January 2020 and the end of November 2021. And then we're going to be going on to Lizzy Carlyle, who's the Head of Environmental Practices for the National Trust. Emmie Kell will follow Lizzy. Emmie is the CEO of the Cornwall Museums Partnership. And then Fiona Wotton, Chief Executive of Creative Kernow. And then last but by no means least, Councillor Martyn Alvey, who is the Cornwall Council Cabinet Member with responsibility for the environment. So a whole range of different people and organisations that hopefully will have be thinking really hard about what they can do. Okay, Luke, over to you. Thank you so much for coming, by the way.
No, it's great having me. Thank you. And really good to be here and good to carry on talking about the environment despite my change in job roles on Monday. So look, the ideas were brilliant that I heard, and it was great hearing the feedback from the groups. I think the real challenge is how do we take what is quite positive ideas and put them into practice? And I think that's the real challenge. So listening to the ideas, there's no shortage of individuals and groups who have an intervention that would make a difference. The problem is it's hard to get them all joined up to deliver them at scale. So the bits that I thought, I agreed with nearly everything that was said. So the bits I'll just pick out that I thought were excellent. I love the idea of us having a better agreement, a compact between people in authority and organisations and the people about access to nature. So the 15-minute communities, the 10-minute communities, the 4-minute communities, it's kind of like insert small number of minutes and community after it. Whatever number that you settle on as a county, it's a really important step because it sets a priority that says access to nature is important. And if you say access to nature is important, then you have to say what type of nature and how do you ensure that everyone has access. Then you're talking about equitable access to nature, because it's certainly true that in Cornwall, very much like in Plymouth, the more money you have, the more access to nature you enjoy. The less money you have, the less access to nature you enjoy. And as part of this, we need to be, I think, really building in a social justice element. I would say that I'm a dodgy lefty, but a social justice element into your environmental policy to make sure that when you are proposing stuff, it's not just those people who have money in their pocket who can afford to access that intervention, but it's people who don't. And in many cases, actually, you get a more profound and positive financial, mental health, physical, economic impact from targeting interventions at lower economic groups where they have poorer outputs in a nature-deprived, nature-starved way than others bits. And that does then challenge you about where you are on electric vehicles, where you are on access to public transport, because there's always a temptation and there's a risk, I think, of this space. Like those people who are making that really profound positive suggestions, and there's some brilliant of them, naturally, as the first step, lead that towards those communities that can afford to access a service at a higher premium or without the financial support. And I think that is something that I heard a few times, which was great to hear in terms of people being aware of that. The other bit that I just really liked is around retrofit. Retrofit is deeply unsexy. However, it's absolutely essential if we are to reduce the carbon emissions of our built environment. And if you look at the council reports about where carbon is produced in council areas in the southwest, housing and our buildings tends to be the main area where we see carbon emissions. Transport and industry tend to be second and third, and that's the case with nearly every single area of the West Country. So if we want to have a proper retrofit policy, it has to be street by street. It can't just be someone that can navigate a complex funding system and put in the right forms and do the right procurement and get 3 quotes and all those other types of things that make it very hard to access. It needs to be literally a street by street approach. But for those councillors that are on here, I think there's an enormous role for local government and communities to set thresholds, to say no more will we accept buildings built below this level. And when we are looking at that, that means you can also look at shortening supply chains to say, actually, if you are building in the West Country, you should ensure that a certain component of your supply chain comes from local businesses, comes from within a 100-mile radius or something, or make it smaller. But then you can also specify that building nature in. And no one said it, but I will love to listen to hear people say about including Swift bricks in new builds and in retrofits. Swift bricks are like a breeze block with a hole in, like those wonderful little swifts those birds build their nest into. So it's a way of building nature into your built environment rather than just building something or retrofitting something and then attaching nature to it as an afterthought. It's how can you build it in? And if you are having that level of thought about building nature into your environment, it's not only about Swift bricks, then it can be about the nature mix of green spaces, your access to green spaces, how so many new developments and refitted developments come with little steps. That means that people with mobility issues really struggle to access that next bit of a garden or green space. How do you make sure that all those considerations are taken into account? But if you do all those things together and the ideas that I've been hearing today and have an idea about how you deliver it, then I think we are on a path for something really quite special. Final point that I think it's worth noting is that around this space, one of my concerns is that we are setting up a debate where you will see people who believe in climate, who believe in the profound effects of carbon emissions, and believe in the urgency of decarbonising, but also protecting nature, will come up against those people who either don't believe that or do believe it but can't access it. So getting rid of 32 million gas boilers as a good example is a real challenge. A gas boiler costs £1,000 at the moment. That's a huge amount of money for most people. An air source heat pump costs 11 grand. Now, if we're going to talk about getting rid of gas boilers, we've got to make sure that people don't pay any more than they would do for a gas boiler to get an air source heat pump. That's an enormous challenge. But in that space, if you don't make the case for including people to go along with it, I fear we might be having that same clash that we saw over Brexit, the same clash that we're seeing over the pandemic, with people saying that we can't access this, so therefore we won't do it. And we need everyone to be able to afford to do it. So the ideas that I heard were brilliant. Keep them coming up, but let's make sure that those ideas get attached to an action plan and a funding mechanism, even if it's initially at a small scale, to then bid up and scale up, because we're going to need 1,000,001 different interventions to decarbonise our economy and protect nature in the southwest, rather than one big thing that will make all the difference. So those ideas were brilliant, and really keen to hear what the other listeners have to say.
Thanks, Luke. My name's Lizzy, Carlyle. I work at the National Trust on our climate and environment policy. And again, fantastic to hear everybody's thoughts and ideas. So some things really struck home with me, and I just thought I'd talk a little bit about how your ideas kind of are feeding into thinking that we're doing in the Trust. But there were some other things to take away as well. So first of all, on the interconnected nature of the wicked climate change problem and how it is a kind of complex problem involving social, economic, environmental issues is something in the National Trust I think we've really taken to heart. And so we have made climate action one of our key strategic priorities, linked very closely with our desire to reverse the decline in nature. And that means throughout the organisation, all of our teams and departments are required to think about how they're taking action around climate change. And you know, for me, I've been around this for a long time. That's been a real step change actually in thinking, in getting those ideas coming from every part of the organisation. So for example, our financial colleagues who work with our investment portfolio have taken away a goal to make sure our investment portfolio is zero carbon by 2030. Equally, we're working with our visitor experience teams to make sure that new visitor infrastructure that goes in is as very low carbon as possible and resilient for future climate impacts. So we've used a moniker RACE, which is reduce, adapt, capture more carbon through our land, and engage. And it was that engage bit that really struck a chord with what you were saying about education and improving understanding of climate change. And obviously we're not a formal education organisation, but we recognise that we've got a really, really strong role to play in using our reach across our members and our supporters to talk about climate change. And we really want to do that in a very place-based way. So really telling the stories at our places of the things that we're experiencing in terms of climate change and the actions that we're taking to them. So we've been doing a lot of that this year. You might have seen some of it, some video stories, some ranger-led walks. We're doing much more activity online around climate action based on the things that we're experiencing. And that's really to try and bring our, close to 6 million members now with us, and so that they understand the change and feel more comfortable with it, because change is hard for everybody. But hopefully then that moves them into a space where they feel more confident and able to take action themselves. And that is a huge factor in building people's resilience to that climate anxiety, which I think we really need to face into quickly. Our engagement doesn't stop with our visitors members though, because we do really use our advocacy power that we have in the National Trust to advocate for better climate policies. So a couple of the things that came through on the ideas around greening our homes, we are talking to government right now about how you do that without losing the heritage value of traditional buildings, because we know those buildings, the types of buildings that we look after are going to be the predominant buildings that we're going to have in 2050. Actually, they are going to be those traditional buildings. They're not all going to be new builds. So we need to find the techniques that allow those buildings to be warm, comfortable, and affordable to heat. But we also need to find ways that do that without losing that cultural value, which I think is going to be, again, so important in terms of building resilience for people and individual well-being. We're also regularly badgering government on land management policies and making sure that our agricultural policies, support schemes, etc., all support the kind of climate and nature outcomes that we want. Really good to hear your thoughts around infrastructure changes, and food waste is something we are challenged with for sure. We have a lot of tea rooms. Hopefully you've experienced one or two of them, but you know, it's difficult if you treat each one on a very individual basis. So it was really good to hear that idea of clusters. I think that's something that I'll take away and think how we might treat a cluster of properties and treat the food waste from those. We are, of course, trying to minimise the food waste from occurring in the first place. So we're doing some work around looking at all the recipes and kind of trying to zero in on the recipes about where food waste is occurring, as well as looking at the carbon footprint of those recipes too. And the other infrastructure piece was around the renewable energy. And I think this is somewhere where actually we feel quite proud of the work we've done around installing appropriate renewables in our places in a really sensitive way that respects the kind of landscape and heritage and natural value of our places. So we've put in hundreds of hydros, heat pumps, biomass boilers, and that now is providing almost 50% of our own heat and power use for the trust. But there's more to be done, and I think it was really interesting hearing about the marine technology, because I think that's one area that we haven't explored yet. So we are still on the learning curve for these things. And then if I can just finish up talking about transport. We do care deeply that all of our visitors come to our places pretty much by car at the moment, and most of those cars are still fossil fuel. So we have an enormous carbon footprint wrapped up in our visitor travel, and it is something we really, really want to tackle. One example in Cornwall actually is at the Tin Coast, where I think our property has worked in really close collaboration with other attractions in the area to really try and make sure that public transport and other active transport, walking, cycling routes can help link up the attractions around the Tin Coast. And that seems like a really positive way forward to tackle this problem, because otherwise, you know, our properties are all rural to a large degree. And it's only by creating those networks that I think we can start making things like bus routes and other public transport means more viable. So thank you very much. So good to hear all your ideas. And if anyone's got any particular thoughts about what the National Trust should or shouldn't be doing, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Hi there, so my name is Emmie, Kell. I am CEO at Cornwall Museums Partnership. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you this afternoon. It's been really interesting to hear the feedback. I'm going to give you some reflections from my perspective as somebody working in the cultural and heritage sectors, but specifically working with Cornwall's community of 70 museums. So the first point that really struck a chord with me was the point about interconnectedness that a couple of the groups had focused on. And I think what that made me think about was the need for kind of systems thinkers in terms of, particularly in terms of leadership roles, and how, you know, those of you who know something about Cornwall Museums Partnership will know that one of our core values is collaboration, and that idea of working beyond your own organisation and being able to see your impact as part of a network and part of a group of communities, a network of communities, is really, really important. And I'm wondering if there's something that we need to get better at in terms of recruiting people with systems thinking mindsets at a leadership level. So that to me feels important. One of the things that we've been doing at Cornwall Museums Partnership is using the kind of format of the UN Global Goals to help us restructure and rewrite our business plan, because that helps us to focus on some of those impacts with communities. We found that a really useful way of going about part of that kind of strategic challenge. In terms of climate adaptation, there's some real challenges in terms of, for museums in particular, warmer, wetter conditions for historic buildings and historic collections give us some real challenges. We will have to start thinking about heritage that we let go and heritage that we keep, and whether that's to do with coastal communities or other things that we cannot approach in a sustainable way, and communities need to be involved in decisions about what we value and what we keep and what we let go. So that's something that museums are thinking about at the moment. In terms of understanding climate change and that piece around knowledge and skills and education, just a plea really to the floor that museums are a very rich data and mainly untapped source of data, particularly natural history collections, but also photography collections, archaeological collections. There is a lot of information there that is not used particularly effectively by the academic community and beyond to help us understand climate change. So our museums in Cornwall have brilliant natural history collections, so please do reach out and connect with them. Another point about education and kind of conversations and in involving communities in this sort of planning for climate adaptation that I was thinking about was this kind of civic infrastructure that we have, not just in the network of 70 museum buildings that we have, but our wider cultural organisations. They are in every town and place across Cornwall. It's a piece of civic infrastructure that is quite untapped. So again, there's opportunities for thinking about those places, those cultural venues as places for discussion. And we've been working in museums with local climate action groups to sort of welcome in people and communities to start those conversations inspired by some of our museum collections. I'm sitting next to Fiona Wotton. I'm going to hand over to her in a second, but she was involved, and her organisation, Creative Kernow, involved in making a brilliant film earlier on this year as part of the cultural response to the G7. And one of the phrases in that film that I really loved was, forget the old ways and remember the older ones. And that really made me think about, the information that we have in museum collections about sustainable living and sustainable practices, much of which we have forgotten. And to people's point earlier on about education, there is way too much celebration of the Industrial Revolution in the heritage community and not enough critical kind of thinking and presentation of that. And there's a real opportunity for us to think about how we do that differently. I guess in terms of that conversation with the public and education, it feels to me like City of Culture, which some of you will know Cornwall has been shortlisted for. It is a real opportunity to reach communities, but particularly tourists. So lots of the reflection that came back was thinking about the resident population in Cornwall. And Lizzy, in the last reflection, touched on the fact that actually we have a real opportunity to influence the behaviour of a large number of people who come to Cornwall every year, much bigger numbers visiting Cornwall than actually live here. And Peter mentioned holiday lets, but I think there's a real, that kind of elephant in the room is tourism and tourist behaviour. And City of Culture is an opportunity for us to show some leadership in thinking about how we do tourism differently, I think. I've certainly been part of conversations recently where people have been reflecting back that they've had a really good year. Well, what does good look like is my question, because loads of people coming to Cornwall, making loads of waste, driving cars around may not be the version of good that we all share in this conversation. So yes, a plea for the kind of focus on interconnectedness, a better reflection on tourism, the opportunities and the challenges, and to use museums and the heritage community as a place to discuss and a source of inspiration and knowledge. I'm going to hand over to Fiona now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and for all the really interesting things that I've heard from the discussions. I'm going to start with a point from the first group, which is around the role of the organisation, because I think that's something that we're thinking through a lot at the moment at Creative Kernow. We're doing lots to measure our impact. We're aiming to be net carbon zero by 2030, but need to work out whether that's even feasible. Thinking about the kind of resources that we have. We have a site with one BREEAM excellent building. As a high achiever, I instantly looked at the report and said, well, why did we not get outstanding? And it's to do with the materials. We've got a lot of concrete in that building. And so when we think about building in the future, we need to be thinking about it in a different way. And we also have old buildings, and how we retrofit those are a real challenge, but we're doing our best to work through those issues. I think also as at the moment we have regular funding from Cornwall Council, and I think there's an opportunity there, if that funding is going to continue, which I know is up for debate at the moment, for us to play a greater role in terms of the key performance indicators that we're given by our funders. It's certainly coming from the Arts Council. And I think we can do more in that space. We can be held to account, and we certainly want to kind of own the space in terms of bringing together our wider networks to think about the impact that they have. And particularly in the creative sector, where we've got so many freelancers and micro businesses, we're all trying to do their bit, but feel like their impact is lost. We feel like we can bring people together to have bigger debates about that. We have something called CLASH, which is our Climate and Sustainability Hive. And I particularly engineered that acronym for it to have a bit of a onomatopoeic impact, because behaviour change is difficult. It does bring people into conflict sometimes, particularly within the creative industries. There's debates there about, what is sustainable, what is going to have a good impact, and we need to have that place for debate, in the same way that Emmie's talking about museums being a place for exploring the role that heritage has in informing the public about climate change. We want to do that through our kind of networks across Cornwall. We have one space, but we have lots of different networks which go all across Cornwall. That sort of leads into this sort of point about resources, because we're all short of them, and we all need them. We can play a role in campaigning for those resources, and kind of holding the space for the debate about what are the appropriate resources to make that happen. And I think there was a lot said about transport, and having been involved in a cultural tourism programme in my previous role, and trying to kind of work through how we implant sustainable transport into thinking about cultural tourism, it feels like transport needs to be put right up to the top of the agenda when we're planning these kind of cultural activities. It needs to come first, not last. And it's really difficult for us as sort of creative people to think about bus routes, and certainly I've been brought into those conversations, and they spun me out slightly, but we do have to put them first, because otherwise it will always be that add-on, like, oh yeah, we should put the electric chargers in, or oh, which are the bus routes. That needs to come first, otherwise it will always be forgotten. But before that, I think that kind of small community idea is really important for our region. We've been doing a lot of work in that space, making sure that there is a rich cultural offer that happens in every community in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. So that kind of village hall offer, making sure that there's small investments which can create cultural work that's relevant, that's about the stories of that place, which contributes to actually becoming that kind of authentic offer, which is what all the tourism professionals will tell you is, what attracts people into your place. But that is about local people. It's for them first. It's year round, and it also puts investment into venues like the village hall or the school hall, or the making the case for the bus route as well. It's really important for that. And that links on to skills, which was brought up. What do we need to develop sustainable communities? What do we need to make? What do we need to repair? And I think that's a space that we're working in as well. I actually found a diagram that I'd written in the first year of my PhD, which is too long ago to mention now, which was entitled Creative Skills for Sustainable Communities. And it was all kind of thinking through that approach, that sort of whole community response to climate change, and reducing resource use and waste along the supply chain. What I'm pleased to say is that with Emmie, we have developed a programme which we'll hopefully be able to talk about in a bit more detail soon, which will put some of that emphasis into communities around Cornwall. And the other, just my final point, was around that connection to nature. Someone mentioned to me the other day about how they talked about the entry-level drug being the beach litter pick. And I think where creativity kind of fits into that is, what happens to the waste? Sometimes people are making that into really quite inspirational artwork that, tells the story and helps us to think through what we do with that. And I think we need to kind of think about what are those other kind of entry-level drugs that get people either into nature or into campaigning, and to just make sure that people are energised in tackling this crisis. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Councillor Martyn Alvey.
Thank you. Well, topping and tailing with a couple of politicians. And you'll be pleased to hear that actually there's very little that Luke said that I would disagree with. And of course, the big challenge at the end, and as Luke pointed out, is that of money. Amazing range of subjects covered today. And I just want to pick up on a few of them. First of all, the discussion around recycling and composting, and of course, food waste, and absolutely essential. And ashamedly, Cornwall sits right down at the bottom of the national scale in terms of our recycling, and we're keen to do something about that and encourage more people to recycle and look at ways of doing that. We are soon, with our new contract, to be introducing a food waste collection, a weekly food waste collection, as part of the new waste contract for the whole of the county. But in terms of composting, that is something which we would really hope and encourage that town and parish councils might wish to consider, is getting those composting points actually established within their communities. On the subject of our recycling rates, and linked actually as well to education and young people, last night after our first council, our full council meeting, we held the first what we're calling annual conversations with young people, where a group of 25 young people taken from the Young Ambassadors Scheme and the Future Leaders Scheme all came to County Hall, and working with some of the members, some of the key officers and some facilitators, we held workshops looking at how young people could actually have an influence on changing the way we live and think, with a big focus there on climate change and sustainability. And the group that I was working with, they came up with a desire to actually become involved in the council's promotion of recycling. And so actually working with that group of young people over the coming weeks, the plan is to come up with a publicity campaign which they will be part of. So you'll see them popping up on the social network, video clips and so on, actually trying to not just encourage their peer group of young people to become involved and promote recycling, but also the wider community, their parents, and really the idea came from, for example, within one of the villages that sit within my division. The local school actually did some signposts to encourage people to stop speeding. So those pictures were then converted into proper signs and actually attached to the speed sign posts below them, and have demonstrably had an effect on speeding within the community. Another area that was discussed was around transport, and particularly for a rural county like Cornwall, that modal shift is a conundrum. And a mention was made of Bristol and London, and where there is more potential to bring in, for example, electric buses. In Cornwall, the big challenge is to get people to get on the buses in the first place. And it is that chicken and egg situation of the buses, as someone mentioned, running empty. We have actually received a large chunk of money from government, 23.5 million, which actually was to be rolled out last year, but with the pandemic and the going through a period of discouraging people from travelling on buses, we're hoping we're going to be rolling it out in the new financial year. One of the things that we're trying to achieve is the £1 bus fare for anything under 3 miles, to encourage those people, for example, living on the outskirts of Truro, who would normally, particularly if there's a couple of them, they were going into town. It's cheaper for them to jump in their car, drive 2 miles into town from Short Lanes End or from Plain Place, and park in town than it is to get a bus. Now, if they could each jump on a bus for £1, hopefully that will see that that change gradually take place as people recognise that actually it's cheaper to go by bus, and also we benefited from a massive increase in new buses in Cornwall. Cornwall used to be the place where buses came to die. Fortunately, we've had that massive investment, so we've got one of the most modern fleets in the country now. Finally, because I'm watching the time here, and I appreciate that we are precious for time, talk about holiday lets, planning, local supply chains and second homes. Again, couldn't agree more that this is a challenge, and this is one of our devolution asks of government to actually give us more power to tax second homes through increased council tax. So at the moment, whilst we can charge a second home owner full council tax, what we can't do is charge any more than that. We would like to have the ability in areas where second homes are an issue to actually charge double and even triple council tax on those properties. One final point around home retrofits. Again, Cornwall's been a pilot site for home retrofits. Massive challenge in an area like Cornwall, where we've got an ageing property estate, which is very difficult to retrofit. And the challenge, particularly with retrofitting social housing, is whilst you can retrofit a property and make it far more energy efficient, far lower carbon footprint, what you can also find yourself doing if you're not very careful is making it more expensive to run. And particularly with social housing, the last thing you want to be doing is driving people into fuel poverty, whilst perhaps improving the carbon footprint of their home. And one final issue, again, around the retrofit, and we've talked about heritage. Again, I look after heritage within my portfolio. I look after climate change. There's a conflict between the heritage people and my carbon neutral team around the ability to retrofit and do work to make older, particularly listed properties or properties in conservation areas more efficient. So another challenge that we're working on. And I'm looking at the time clicking away, so I better stop talking now.
I've been furiously typing away because I want to keep notes about what everybody's been saying, and there's just been such a lot of fascinating stuff. I want to say also that over the next couple of weeks and months, we will be going through the proceedings of today, the recording of today, and we will be putting together a little bit of a report so that we can use it as a bit of a platform for the next step in our wider conversation. So look out for that on our Institute of Cornish Studies website. And so look out for the report over the next few months on the ICS website. Also follow us on social media, Twitter, and also Facebook. Maybe somebody might put the Twitter handle or our sort of like various handles and website in the chat, just in case people don't know about it already. But I want to say, first of all, an absolutely enormous thank you to all of you, like absolutely all of you. Our expert witnesses, Claire, Caitlin, Steffen, Ian and Juliet, really thought-provoking stuff there. Our policy listeners, Luke, Lizzy, Emmie, Fiona and Martyn, all of the people that have helped to put this on our events team, Lou, Sabrina and Steph and Ben, who's been our social media person, who's just helped to make this event happen. And of course, to all of you participants, every single one of you has contributed a lot of really interesting stuff that it's just so much to unpick and explore. It's a real privilege to be able to be a part of this. Okay. The recording of this event is going to be going onto our YouTube channel, which you'll be able to access through YouTube, but also through our website. The website itself, if you put Institute of Cornish Studies into any reputable search engine, we will come up. And just sort of join our continuing conversations about Cornwall of climate, who we are, and what we need moving forward. Excellent. Thank you such a lot, everybody. We've been the Institute of Cornish Studies, which is part of the University of Exeter, and is and this is part of also our Green Futures project as well. So nice one. Thank you, everybody.